Ladies and gentlemen, we are ready to hear weekly updates from the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission by Alexander Hug, Principal Deputy Chief Monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine.
Good afternoon. I'm speaking to you from the offices of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission monitoring team in Dnipro. I'm of the last leg of a 5-day visit to eastern Ukraine. It has been a trip in which we have seen much progress and one that has been frustrating too, full of promises and potential and yet somehow falling short. Indeed, just like the past 4 years, where agreements have been signed but never fully implemented, where decision makers say they want peace but still the violence continues. Dear friends, this week saw a long overdue process. Since late 2016, the OSCE SMM has been engaged in low-key dialogue facilitation, gently coaxing people on the ground, facilitating them to undertake repair work on civilian infrastructure that provide water, gas and electricity to hundreds of thousands of civilians on both sides of the contact line. On Tuesday, we finally saw the first major step forward. Repairs were completed on the South Donbas main water pipeline. Working together on the ground, people from both sides of the contact line were able to do this in one of the most violent places in Donbas, the prom zone between Avdiivka and Yasinovata. It's a significant development, one which I hope will lead to more. This work, involving dialogue and cooperation, proves that locally based arrangements can work. However, the only sure way of ensuring the long-term sustainability of critical infrastructure lies in a sustainable ceasefire. And that can only happen when the weapons are removed, when the sides have disengaged and mines have been removed. It's very simple. After more than 4 years of violence, there is no doubt that the needs of the civilian population are dependent on the sides implementing in full the agreements they have signed. But they have not. Everywhere we have been this week, we have met decent people living with the consequences of the sides' failure to honor the commitments they made. They are sick and tired of 4.5 years of living in someone else's madness. We met them in Kramatorsk, Horlivka, Donetsk, Luhansk, Stanica Luhanska, Mayorsk, Severodonetsk, Kharkiv, and here in Dnipro. Some who have remained and endure, others enduring a different ordeal, living in a life in suspension as internally displaced persons. People who want only peace. In Mayorsk, they told us about the everyday realities of living in the madness that is now Donbas. Of queuing for hours at checkpoints, of corruption, sometimes seen at these checkpoints, of having to undertake what amounts to a 2-day trip just to get their pensions. One woman told us about how near impossible it was to visit her son's grave in Slavyansk. Another woman in her 80s spoke of the nighttime shelling in Horlivka. Despite some improvements, at Stanica Luhanska bridge, where up to 8,000 people cross on foot on a daily basis, we saw that the situation remains dire. People, many elderly and infirm, forced to climb up and down ramps. Here was the scene on Wednesday when we crossed. Thousands of people who want what is theirs, forced to endure what is for many of them the impossible and unbearable. They want this to end, they want an end to this conflict, and yet it goes on. Everywhere there is acknowledgement that weapons must be withdrawn. Everywhere there is acceptance that the sides must not be in close proximity. Everywhere all agree that there must be demining, and everyone agrees that the OSCE SMM is crucial in verifying the process. Somewhere, however, there is a logjam. Somewhere there is a block in the process. It was agreed that the 2016 framework decision on disengagement of forces and hardware should be the start of a process of disengagement all along the contact line. And yet, it hasn't even fully happened in the 3 pilot disengagement areas. In fact, there has been regression. Last week, the OSCE SMM recorded 10 ceasefire violations inside the Zalote disengagement area and 1 inside the Petriske disengagement area. Inside the Zalote disengagement area, we also observed new positions assessed as belonging to the Ukraine armed forces. Inside the Petriske disengagement area, we observed Ukraine armed forces, soldiers and members of the armed formations and armed combat vehicles. It was also agreed that heavy weapons should be withdrawn beyond agreed withdrawal lines. And yet last week we saw 44 weapons in violation of those withdrawal lines. 31 were in areas not controlled by the government and 13 in government-controlled areas. Among them were 31 multiple launch rocket systems near non-government controlled Krustalny and Muinsk, and another 8 multiple launch rocket systems near government controlled Malinivka. And in Article 6 of the Minsk Memorandum and the Trilateral Contact Group decision on mine action, it was agreed that mines should be removed and no new ones laid. Yet last week we saw many mines. SMM unmanned aerial vehicles again spotted rows of anti-tank mines laid across roads near government-controlled Novokalinove, between government-controlled Bohdanivka and non-government-controlled Viktorivka, and on the western edge of non-government-controlled Bikuzi. And for the first time, our UAV spotted 9 anti-tank mines laid out on a road across a road close to government-controlled Vodiane. And most fundamental of all, it was agreed that there should be no shooting of any weapon, that there should be a ceasefire. And yet we counted over 5,500 violations of the ceasefire last week. Agreement, but little action. Promises made, but not kept. Clearly, somewhere there are people unwilling to make the Minsk process work. Dear friends, we all understand that peace cannot be restored overnight. It is a long, hard process to undo damage and trust and pain. But it must start somewhere. It must start with good faith and with the will to make it happen. There is no doubt in my mind that ordinary people in eastern Ukraine want it to happen. 4.5 years is a long time. 4.5 years of living in conditions not seen in Europe for decades, where basic necessities are no longer taken for granted, where water, gas, electricity are not always available. 4.5 years where you are unsure if your child will come home from school. 4.5 years of being caged in with roads blocked and bridges blown, where the rule of law is often replaced by the rule of the jungle, where hundreds of thousands have fled and others remain in fear and want. 4.5 years that must be brought to an end. 4.5 years that can be brought to an end. Dear friends, the difference between compliance and non-compliance is the difference between continued violence and peace. For the countless number of ordinary people we met this week, the difference is huge. It's the difference between an often violent, distressing and difficult existence and a life of normality, security and safety. It's the difference between how people live and how they have once lived. For the few people who hold the fate of eastern Ukraine in their hands, the difference is small. They do not stand huddled in queues for hours and hours just to travel a few kilometers. Their homes are warm and safe, and their children are safe. For them, the difference between compliance and non-compliance, the difference between continued violence and peace is purely a matter of will. Our trip this week has shown that there are people who are willing to work together, willing to ensure people have gas, water and electricity. It has been heartening to see it, to know there is still hope. It has been equally frustrating, and for the hundreds of thousands of people living along the contact line, it has been tragic. That somewhere there are still people unwilling to end this tragedy. This week, on the ground, it has been shown that there is a will and a way forward, a way out of this mess. There is another way. Where there is a will, there is a way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hu, for the detailed report. Now it's time for questions. If there are no questions, thank you for being with us and see you soon.
Thank you. Goodbye.